So, in today's video, I want to give a small synthesis about my personal situation and perhaps for many folks around the world.
Het zijn de Amazon Prime Deal dagen. 2 dagen lang geweldig.
Dear reader, there you go, the biggest elephant in my room, or is it just a mass psychosis unfolding? Since this side is an honest view on my experience in the school of life, and therefore maybe an accelerator for someone else their life trajectory, hence why I would like to share my quite personal experience of one particular journey many fiction books can be written from. So before you jump to conclusions like so many do, I dare you to keep an open mind rather than analyzing this to the bone. I haven't been writing anything for the last couple of months because of personal circumstances and obstacles I had to overcome. During the process of finishing my Bachelor's of Economics, Management and Law, I have been forced into a psychiatric hospital because I was practicing some capoeira, movement, acting, and free running in public without enough clothing on. The thing that really sickens me that this is enough reason to put someone in a forced medical treatment based upon the law BOPZ in the Netherlands. And why does the APV discriminate so many called bedelaars when asking for a cigarette is an ancient old conversation starter. Although I have to admit that my creative pursuits are a little bit out of the box, it does not mean I'm psychotic, just a little wicked. That's all. Like so many types of individuals on the Monster Energy can are outlawed, my ghost trip adventures in the former brothel of Breda have come to an end and started again in my current Reiki apartment. Therefore, I would like to take this opportune moment to share my experiences of a psychiatric hospital. I do sincerely hope that others might be empowered to do things a little different if my life situations match those of yours and learn from my experiences, successes and mistakes. I think this is a worthwhile pursuit to follow, since as long as I'm authentic, honest and creative in communicating through stories like these, others can reap the benefit of the flaws and successes I celebrate during my never-ending parties. So the biggest challenge for me now is to overcome other people who think I'm crazy and psychotic. That I have a vivid imagination, impassioned with movement and people, acting and arts, and that I like to tell mythological stories among folklore, does not mean you should take me to serious B or A. And or should those interested in psychology diagnose a person like myself as psychotic without actually getting to know the background of an individual or talking to them for realistic, energetic, affirmative life. I took the time to write this article or essay because I want to be objective about my experiences here after a proper span of time. Perhaps this piece of writing can encourage those who find themselves in similar life situations in Europe or the globe in which their freedoms are taken away because of some irrational reasoning by their lawgivers. So is the Ombudsman of the Netherlands, Reiner van Zutphen, very corrupt. I will therefore elaborate a bit during this article. To be honest, it is extremely difficult to continue following the ancient principle of self-governance, also known as self-determination, against an army of well-intended people who think they know what is best for you, during a paradigm transition by which drama rules the skies. This is an ancient conversation of determination versus self-determination. The individual versus the collective. I argue that by having a sociocratic conversation with a flair of raw, we can gap the clashes of the differences that occur because of the two opposing philosophies. In so doing, learn to experience more territories of mutual understanding and therefore positive synergy or win-win relationships in which 1 + 1 = 3, rather than negative synergy in which 1 + 1 equals, also known as negative collateral damage or most likely codependence. Nuclear family systems. When finally found someone, what do we project for not the inner part we miss about ourselves? The 4 agreements of creativity and the Sociocratic method or dialogue techniques can be of assistance and useful resource to create positive synergy in an environment or culture like that of a psychiatric hospital or just on the street level during the onset of indeed a mass psychosis. At least the following helps for me. The 4 agreements. Do not take anything personal, which is very hard when finding oneself in many social settings. Always do your best. To do your best can also imply laying flat down. To recover, obviously. Do not assume, or when stuck in traffic, an assumption can be life or death. Therefore, to assume is to test one's own perceptions. Be impeccable with one's word, feelings, and acts. A few examples or guidelines for having a good sociocratic conversation are: seek for truth, learn to listen, be patient, being able to switch perspectives, do not discuss, merely have a conversation, and otherwise, just sus. Think together and along, rather than winning the conversation. Be open-minded while keeping a ration. Here's, by the way, a link to a Dutch article that goes in depth with the sociocratic conversation for those keen on learning. www.boltontraining.nl/Socrates gesprek. What is een sociocratisch gesprek? Try a Google. So in the pursuit of governing oneself, one has to have the freedom to make individual decisions, leading up to more definite choices, and therefore also mistakes to learn from. Therefore, the philosophy of self-determination requires enough freedom, proper mentorship, responsibility, and self-reflection for it to work properly. Without the necessary ingredient of agency to continue to make mistakes, I am of the perspective one cannot develop him or herself by use of experimentation and self-determination. Following this rationale, you need to have some sort of breathing room in social, so-called complex adaptive organizing systems, or operational system depending upon your likes, for things to emerge naturally based on self-organizing principles shortly described above. This philosophy of free will and freedom of choice should not be seen as a justification for example criminal behavior. yet it does include criminal behavior in the process of learning how to make refined choices in one's life. If criminal behavior is marked by pain, then the pain teacher, referring to Paul Chek, will present itself automatically for the agents in the system in order to readjust their perspectives and decision-making processes, either in this lifetime or another, depending on when an alignment of magnetic ties due to inflicted karma can be resolved. If not, then that means that criminal behavior is rewarding in and of itself, or that people simply enjoy pain, which I believe is not a valid statement in creating a quality life and or a middle path. As long as we define criminal behavior by the level of pain you're inflicting upon another agent in the system, pain is, I feel, a good method of Pain is, I think, a good method of. Therefore, precedent for making empowered choice in view of better using as long as we define criminal behavior by the level of pain, by making refined choices based upon the feedback one receives from their environments. These feedback loops is what any reasonable agent in the system can use in order to grow in understanding, and therefore the ability to act differently to enhance the quality of one's life. Pain is therefore precedent for making empowered choices in the future, or better yet, using one's imagination to simulate scenarios without having to learn them the hard, oftentimes painful way. This is an ability to be learned by the use of active imagination, as Carl Gustav Jung has described. However, here I do not want to talk about criminal law, but the remainders of the welfare state in the Netherlands, and especially the law of BOPZ, which is changed by now, doesn't matter. I say remainders because in times of potential economic and political turmoil in Europe and the Western fall in general, one cannot expect the welfare state to continue as it is right now. It is simply too costly and in many ways inefficient to have a lasting life during our time and age. Many find themselves in codependent relationships with a system that is designed to keep you stuck if you do not have an intrinsic motivation to find an occupation. To me, this is the greatest flaw of the welfare state, in that it breeds conditions in which codependency occurs, which is counterproductive for its intended purposes. It only works if you mentor individuals in actualizing themselves so that they can occupy themselves rather than being couch-locked under a false idea of a pension. By the way, a good resource is www.stichtingpandora.nl. A few bullets to summarize the law BOPZ for those interested. In the Netherlands, you can only be admitted against your free will if you have a mental disorder that has been diagnosed by a psychiatrist, and there is a potential danger to safety and/or safety of others. This goes by distrust, where a person quickly turns into a criminal under suspicion of without any factual crime. If you disagree with the judge's decision, you cannot appeal to the higher courts. You can lodge an appeal for cessation with the Supreme Court, which costs a lot of money. This is therefore a difficult procedure. Ask your attorney for more information. Compulsory admission needs to happen with good reason. In my personal circumstance, I think there wasn't enough reason to do. I just have a very grim, fantastical mindset as a monster energy kenner. However, what for some is sane, for the other is insane. For example, the Wim Hof method could be seen as enough reason, maybe in this case, to execute this form of law on a person. From my perspective, there needs to be a serious indication that one is performing self-destructive behavior towards him or herself, or towards another sentient and or conscious being. in claiming enough reason to violate someone's personal domain of freedom and or safety. By cooperating, you can often prevent the need for drastic measures. This is very important in my experience. You can get out much quicker out of an overanalyzing ethical pursuits when considering guilt is not an emotion. It has no polar opposites. Ethical hell wrote, if you learn to cooperate and show some diplomatic strength in one's relationships. Diplomatic strength is definitely key here, I think. Having that silver fun, alongside some dialogue, to remain free and therefore more creative in one's pursuits. Before someone can start treating you, you need to give your consent. This consent principle is very important from a cybernetic understanding, because if you just give your consent, you can fall prey for treatments that won't work or even have counterproductive effects, long and or short term. In general, the consent principle is key in conversation and cooperating. As long as you do not have a proper objection against a statement, you probably give in by consent. So that's a fair game, I think. This is especially important in considering taking pharmaceuticals or being a part in the production of such medicines that are high in toxins. Hereby stating, I think, that it is generally accepted knowledge that these industries are heavily inclined towards profit and give at best short-term relief, resulting in a numbed down population, also known as a rural population. Why population? Because everybody is a criminal, and taking meds to numb pain or suffering too much is actually not addressing the resolving of underlying causes for pain and suffering. However, being guided and supported by the right medicines is something I sometimes give credit to as well, when absolutely needed. The welfare state in the Netherlands is a complicated system marked by rules, bureaucracy, and a lot of earning models that are slowly changing or disappearing in our times of region shift in Europe and the Netherlands. In my view, it is a system destined to change under our spirit of time. Besides, I have pointed out many times on this website the differences of contemporary mainstream pharmaceutical healing versus holistic or organic healing. An indigenous shaman or holistic practitioner would treat a psychotic or heavily burned out person differently than mainstream Western science and healing does. It would be nice if both of these roles could combine their efforts in providing the best healing approach per individual, so that both worlds can reunite their forces and again learn from the value in their differences of thought, instead of rallying up against those differences like madmen. Whereas Western science diagnosed my personhood as psychotic, a shaman would probably diagnose it as an opportunity for psychic release, catharsis, and mental emancipation, to be in proper command of the senses that are not taught by the written word of libraries. Rather than focusing upon the negative fearful aspects of the human psyche, why not see a psychotic period as something potentially constructive and life-enhancing in one's life? Undergoing such a horrific experience to get initiated is not always pleasurable. Could actually be used as an edge in the game of life, like the so-called bipolar diagnostic people. With the right mindset, treatment and proper guidance and initiation during such a turbulent time, one can truly transform and turn out better, rather than being stuck in pharmaceuticals and become a zombie or a professional victim for the rest of their lifetime, which is the sunken cost of the Netherlands. And why younger generations will not carry the beehive or shitload of elderly people not keen on saying goodbye. If that is indeed your situation, then I do not respect this to settle for mediocrity, when deep down there is a guidance that tells otherwise. Even if the whole world seems to be against you, it is a very natural part of life to be dealt with challenges, in my case, existential challenges. Therefore, I found it to be strange that certified doctors are unwilling to get to know me as a sentient human being, yet judge me based upon assumptions and a lack of proper investigation in what the causes of my so-called unidentified psychosis really are. Like, could you even be more vague? Such an attitude only signals that it is mostly just business treating a person like a business case instead of a sentient, therefore intellectual being capable of expressing thoughts and emotions. The lack of such a proper individual investigation originates out of the overwhelming bookshelf of the welfare systems and our trust in them. The system can become so complicated, accepted as superior, and rigid that doctors are relying upon the systems and protocols rather than using their intelligence to make a well-rounded judgment per case. Personally, I'm not psychotic, according to my own thesis. I just stretch my limits too far, ending up with a mental breakdown, insomnia, with the consequences that I acted out some weird and abnormal behavior that does not fit the norm, yet was not harmful for anyone. So then what about the real psychopaths running the Peacock show? Not fitting the norm could be seen as criminal, only that it does not fit the norm. If being a little eccentric is a crime, then what has culture become? This does not mean one is actually committing a crime by hurting someone or anything. Calling it an unidentified psychosis should not make a case to take away someone's individual liberties, and yet that was what happened. So based upon irrational fears and suspicions about someone's code of conduct, they can basically take away someone's individual liberty nowadays. Again, because fear reigns this age, not love. This should not be the motive to design a welfare system, since suspicions and irrational fears that things might go wrong is just not enough and not on my level. This sort of stuff has more to do with a lack of mutual understanding, miscommunication, xenophobia and knowledge than that it is a real threat or disease. My behavior is a violation of a generally accepted social code of conduct that does not necessarily have to be the code of conduct which is the right thing to do in our time and age. Personally, I like to go on adventures, enjoy sex, wine, drugs, all sorts of stimulations, and capable of remaining sane, and otherwise hold thyself. How can an adventure be any fun without a little danger sneaking around the cabin? It has to do with personality differences that clash together, if persons are not aware of the differences, following this rationale, but instead are afraid to face them or bridge them in mutual understanding and respect. Following this rationale, then throw all pioneers in asylums and see where one society ends up. I am grim enough to dream up such a reality which will lead to an European and or Western drain, also called Eurasia. This sort of stuff is probably why people like Socrates hated democracy. Because if the demons, demos, turn out to be wrong, then you are dependent upon the so-called wicked or Renaissance individuals in the system of society to figure things out and carry others along. Personally, I'm a promoter of individual potential and actualization in the sense that we are all snowflakes. That promoter of individual potential and actualization, there exists a unique blueprint for how that individual can be developed towards his or her brightest potential. A blueprint that needs to be discovered by making many mistakes, learning from them and having proper guidance. And exactly that kind of originality can be seen as a threat or diagnosed as psychotic behavior in the current system in the Netherlands, where the system seems to be at hand, not the officials participating in it as some kind of clockwork orange. Often ritual elders are not in the same biological family, by the way, so without that necessary freedom, one cannot learn through visceral life experiences how he or she can propel oneself into a right trajectory. A social code of conduct is, of course, Dangma, not created, without reason. And there is enough reason to create a code in the world we live in a world that is currently and in our history burned and marked with terror, war, and pain. This is why I take insane high levels of responsibility about my own health, security, and education. Freedom requires self-ownership. Otherwise we fall prey for the temptations life also has to offer us. To me, this is simply a part of life to be taken seriously, but only in one's own sphere. I have given up the desire to own others and change others, because I know I can only change and own myself. That being said, why follow the social conduct and fall prey for in-group preferences when philosophical and technological innovations are called for in our times of regime shift? Global challenges and turbulence, especially for my generation, since I'm only 32 by now, during forms of conduct that shouldn't be necessary, when one can remain calm. During the chaotic times of regime shift, people can easily cling to fundamentalist behaviors and radical forms of conduct, while that shouldn't be necessary when one can remain calm during the political and economic storm in Europe. For example, the fear of terrorist attacks enlarges when we give it more energy to persist and express more fear due to the attention we give that. The same principle can be said about the malfunctions about the welfare system. I think we need to give our psychotic pharmaceuticals. I think we need to give our focused attention in finding solutions rather than treating symptoms, in which an example is anti-psychotic pharmaceuticals. It won't give a lasting transformation for the individual. It just gives another dependency upon the welfare system that feeds into the capitalistic and financial systems that parasite until we indeed fight with sticks and stones, as Albert Einstein already coined. Since I can now relate to such irrational fears on a more personal level, because now my personhood is apparently a danger, I had to come up, really, with all kinds of new magician-like trickster moves to protect my individual freedoms for as far that is still possible based upon the law that I'm dealt with. It is really a new chapter in my life after living in a spooky and adventurous brothel, which was really strange, yet an awesome experience. Who can say that they moved in 1 year from a former monastery to a former brothel to a psychiatric hospital, which is basically a glass castle, and tell the tale in good humor and spirit? Anyone? Don't get me wrong in judging this institute too badly, since I can greatly appreciate the facilities and service of these people, but it does make you tick in a weird way, to be honest. I mean, all my roommates all have their uniqueness, which is violating this sacred societal code of conduct. Obviously, hence the reason why we're all locked here and diagnosed as psychotic, etc. Plus, all this comfort and attention can make someone a spoiled brat. Such a scenario is only possible in the Netherlands, or perhaps other nations like the Scandinavian countries that still have a welfare state, or perhaps New Zealand. I'm not surprised that such laws are actually in place in Europe and the Netherlands, since you kind of have to enforce strict codes of conduct if you want to make the globalization movement and democratic propaganda program work on a large scale. The larger the empire, the more likely strict codes of conduct has to be in place, so that order is kept within reasonable boundaries. However, what if these boundaries are not reasonable anymore, but should be stretched and re-evaluated for the sake of individual and collective prosperity? Is this all humanity's got? To create an even stricter one-world government in which an oasis of control will emerge? Good luck in finding your creative sources then. Because who really still dares to do a Dionysus performance besides the daughter of that fancy dares? Besides, you have systems based upon irrational fears that something might happen, rather than having open and dynamic systems in place to judge an individual based upon context, rather than following just a protocol. Appropriately judging oneself, let alone another person, requires high amounts of intelligence, and if that intelligence is not in place by the authorities, who can enforce such powers like imprisoning me? Then you create potential rebellion and prison break series. How can you ever expect a free bird like myself to stay here any longer than I desire to be? If the show becomes a flattened scenario in which nature is bent towards a rudiment, then what point is there to be expect here to dance with robots? Not only is my domain of freedom violated, also my domain of health is violated because they can enforce you pharmaceutical drugs based upon a diagnostic which is based upon, again, suspicions, not observable facts, or long-term proper research and real contact. Therefore, I can distill that we live in a time and age in which freedoms and/or safeties are getting less, and that it is even possible to imprison a person like myself based upon false accusations by the state, or rather the individuals who think they have the authority to do that. What it does is that it creates damage on a scale that is by many unseen. The violations on individual liberties and security due to philosophical and economic malfunctions based upon false acquisitions and irrational fears is one thing. The other thing is the use of coercion and force to drug people into pharmaceutical zombies, which not only costs more money than it earns, it also creates stagnancy on a spiritual level. Aren't we aware that most big pharma is just a gigantic business model? How ignorant of the people to continue investing in such a model, even when such individuals are aware of it. However, it could very well be that the negative side effects outweighs the short-term advantages greatly. Therefore, again, do no harm in healing as an ideal statement is still what Hippocrates, among many other healing masters, was writing all along. Really, the first wake-up after going through phases of insomnia, I almost literally jumped through armored glass after causing some rumbles because my domain of freedom was violated. Of course, it is not a smart idea to imprison a person like myself based upon the rationale described above and my personality needs. All I can say that acting out my inner Hulk sub-personality did not help me in getting free earlier. It is much smarter to be diplomatic about it. Although that is easy to say, harder to do, we are all still part animal, part human, so what beast do you need to keep in check, you Harvard fox? To be honest, I'm really not impressed by how the Netherlands is coping with the people who are struggling with mental disease. Again, a real shaman doctor would look very different to a person with a mental disease. As I have been sharing on this website before, one has to have the abstraction level to at least thinking systems if you really want to make a sustainable transformation. Could it be health or finance? One has to have the helicopter view and then zoom in to work at root cause level. Even if this mindset is what is lacking, in one of the government-funded mental health institutes, I'm still at. I can write whole books about what I've experienced in the last 10 years. Not only is the state enforced to imprison innocent people like myself, the state should man up and fix the trias politica. It also costs a lot of money to imprison people unnecessarily. So I hope it was an interesting speech.